Call the meeting of Academic Goals and Instructional Improvement Committee to order, please. May I have a roll call?
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Beebe? Dr. Beebe is present. Ms. Bofi?
Here.
Ms. Bofi is present. Ms. Bradford is not in attendance. Mr. Garvey? Mr. Garvey is present. Mr. Gio?
Yes, that's really
Here.
Mr. Gio is present. Ms. Hill?
Present.
Ms. Hill is present. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee is not in attendance. Dr. Moranti?
Present.
Dr. Moranti is present. Ms. Orange-Jones?
Present.
Ms. Orange-Jones is present. Mr. Romer?
Here.
Mr. Romer is present. Mr. Wagasback?
Here.
Mr. Wagasback is present. Mr. Chasson?
Here.
Mr. Chasson is present. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop and give our student representative, Mr. Peyton Chasson, a moment of personal privilege to introduce some people that he has with him here today.
All right, well, with me today, I have, there's three people in the back of the room. First, Mr. Guy Harvey he's a retired principal from Thibodeau High School, and he is an advisor for our student council at Thibodeau High. And along with him is Ms. Beth David. She's an advisor at Thibodeau High School. She's a nationally recognized advisor, and they both have 40-plus years of experience with the school system. Also, Mr. Kalen LaRousse is the president of the Louisiana Association of Student Councils, and he is also the chairman to the National Board for Student Councils. So I do have them here with me today.
We appreciate your attendance and your service with LASC. Thank you very much. May I have the first item on the agenda?
Your consent agenda is ready for approval, adding items 3.1 and 3.2.
Do I have a motion?
So moved.
I have a motion by Mr. Gio, a second by Dr. Moranti. Is there any discussion? Is there any opposition? Next item, please.
Your next item is 2.1 on page 1. Consideration of requests from local education agencies for waivers of policy contained in Bulletin 1706, Regulations for Implementation of the Children with Exceptionalities Act, Subpart 2, Regulations for Gifted and Talented Students, submitted by the State Superintendent of Education. The department recommendation is to approve these two requests.
Is there a motion? I have a motion by Ms. Orange-Jones, a second by Dr. Moranti. I have a comment card from Mr. James Finney. I'll go ahead and take that first, and then
Are
we'll...
you going to do discussion? Do you have a question from a board member first, or do public?
Can I do it however I want? I'm going to take public comment, and then we'll do our discussion.
That's fine.
Thank you. I would hope that you do grant these exceptions, particularly the one for East Baton Rouge Parish, because my daughter, who is about to be a senior at Louisiana Tech, benefited from having been a scholastic, great scholar, whatever, student through middle and high school. But my concern is that the recommendations include tying the hands of the local school boards so they can't add new students to those programs in the upper grades unless they happen to be coming from somewhere else, and that seems like a ridiculous requirement. So I would suggest that you remove that requirement from the recommendation before you move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Hill?
Yes, Superintendent Wright, I have, maybe you can address this question. Reading about the St. Charles Parish school system, will these schools that will be released to gifted students, with their test scores, are these going to be classrooms where they're going to be secluded, or would they be integrated with other students? Because if not, I'm trying to figure out how would we identify their test scores, and if they are going to be secluded, maybe in another school, would their scores be located, be directed to their local districts? Could you explain that to me?
I believe the idea that they are it's a blended class of gifted and high potential, that's what they're calling them, students,
okay,
means that some of the kids test as gifted, but some of the kids are just doing very well academically. They're blending them, which I think is quite a commendable idea, to give more kids an opportunity to receive the same kind of classroom teaching that gifted kids receive.
Okay, so the kids that are not gifted, that are performing highly,
Correct.
What would be the criteria? How would they determine those students? Would it be based only on grades?
I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't believe we have representatives from St. Charles here. I would say that the teacher of the year, who is now our new representative on the academic, or on the
Educator
effectiveness group, thank you, is a gifted teacher from St. Charles. They've got a very strong program. I don't know what exactly the cut score they're using is, but this is a tradition they've had. It's worked very well. Parents have been very satisfied with it, and it expands gifted services essentially. By the way, it also, for whatever it's worth, there are long-term concerns that there are biases inherent in the gifted tests. So this allows for greater diversity and ability to counteract some of those potential biases in tests of giftedness, to have a more diverse class.
And I'll just add, Ms. Hill, I taught in EBR where they used the Scholastic Academy program, and so the practice there was looking at students who had fared well on standardized tests in the past or demonstrated in the classroom high abilities. So, are there any other questions from board members on this item? Yes.
Okay, I see that there's a limit to 8 per setting. So with the blended, are we just saying that there would be 8 students in the class, or 8 gifted students enrolled in the section?
8 high potential students.
8 high potential. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, now, with regard to the concern expressed by the gentleman that we do not allow, I guess once the school year begins and, you know, we can't allow, or I guess the concern is there is no allowance for those who would benefit from this other than those who are out of the country or out of state who transfer in. I don't see that. I've been looking for that in this documentation.
It's under conditions, Ms. Beebe.
Oh, it's under conditions.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
On page 2.
So why would we not allow them if they would meet the criteria? Why would we not? Why would we disallow them to move into the program if they met the criteria for academic purposes? Why would we prevent them from being a transfer student within the district? Here we're allowing them to transfer in from a private or parochial setting and from other districts, other states, other countries, but yet if there's someone within the district who would qualify, then they're prohibited as I read this.
Yeah.
I'm going to make an assumption, Ms. Beebe, and that is that the students are identified before 6th grade. And this assumption is based on my knowledge of students who come through programs like this in terms of their background and ability to get accustomed to this kind of teaching. And so, and I also know that EBR has practiced this for, I taught in EBR starting in 2001, so at least dating back to this time. So this is a practice that has been in place for at least that amount of time. And if there is a representative from EBR in the room, I would appreciate them coming forward to help us understand more clearly.
And this is certainly the recommendation or the request made from the district, EBR, or
from the district, yes.
From the district.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are there any other questions from board members or any other discussion that you'd like to have? Is there any objection to the motion? Okay, motion carries. Next item, please.
Next item is on page 6. Item 2.2, consideration of required K-3 reading assessments, and the department recommendation is to approve.
Is there a motion on the floor? Mr. Guillot moves. Dr. Moranti seconds. Mr. Feeney?
Thank you for what hopefully will be my last visit up here today.
It is. That's all we card out.
And you will probably hope it's my last visit too. One of my main concerns about the school performance system for years has been that it starts too late and ends too soon, concentrates all the weight on grades 3 through 8 or maybe 9 or 10. And so if there is any reasonable way that makes sense to use DIBEL scores to put some value on good work done in kindergarten, first and second grades, I would encourage the department to consider that.
Thank you. Board members?
I have a question.
Yes, Ms. Hill.
If a district decides to opt out of the DIBELS, what would be the alternative as far as what other assessments would they be able to use? Is there a guideline or some standards, or?
We have a set of assessments that districts have proposed in their waivers. There are 4 districts that have proposed waivers specifically, and you know, in this case, we have to balance. On one hand, we have the value of a standard assessment. On the other hand, we have the sense that some districts are deriving greater instructional value out of a specific set of assessments. They are particularly Tangipahoa, Lincoln, DeSoto, and then also Ascension sent in a request for one school that we are continuing to look at. But this has generally been fueled by districts saying that, look, there are early literacy assessments that can help better inform instruction to align with the Common Core state standards. In terms of which specific assessment Tangipahoa and Lincoln and DeSoto are using, do we have those offhand in the waiver requests? We'll get them to you. We've asked, you see the information that's listed in terms of our waiver request in your backup. But this came out of a specific concern that districts are saying, look, the DIBELS doesn't give us everything that we need in terms of informing our instruction, or doesn't align with a battery of interim tests that we're giving in upper grades that we'd like to give in the lower grades. And they wanted that alignment, and I think it's the right thing to do. But we will get that list for you shortly.
And I just say, if the test doesn't meet their needs, then we might be forcing them into a situation where they're giving more tests than we'd like for them to. So they're ultimately giving these extra tests to meet their needs and our policies. Ms. Hill, do you want to wait on getting that information before we vote, or can we proceed with this item?
I'm concerned, and once I look at it, if I have any additional questions, I'll contact you.
Or maybe pull it up tomorrow. Okay. All right. Let's go.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just curious.
I should preface this by saying we have an internal working group who is looking through these assessments to see whether or not we believe that they meet the standard. But just so you know, DeSoto asked for the STAR Early Literacy and STAR Reading assessment. Jefferson Parish requested the Fonts and Pinnell benchmark assessment. Lincoln has asked for Reading A to Z, and Tangipahoa has asked for the Scholastic Reading Inventory SRI assessment.
So because I know you said we have an internal group that's looking over the assessments, but we're not going to allow them to implement them until you guys give them the okay? Because I don't want to have a situation where it may not meet the standards, they decided to do this, and I just, for the children's sake. You know?
It's really until you give them the okay. I mean, we're bringing every request for a waiver to you.
I understand the part of the waiver,
Yeah.
but my concern is I know you guys are doing internal assessment to make sure that it's lined with our standards and guidelines. So I want to make sure, even though the board may okay this, that we are sure that they're aligned with our standards and guidelines before we, as a board, say, hey, you have the waiver, move forward, and then a month or two from now, a couple of weeks from now, they may not align. That's
Yeah.
my concern.
That's fair. I mean, there are other assessments that I think it would be fair to say we would probably have an issue with, and we would tell them that before the waiver comes. I think if there were an application for a test to be used that we didn't think actually did align with measures of rigor, and there are some, in fact, in my letter to districts today, I'm talking a little bit about a literacy benchmarking assessment that I don't think is rigorous enough to be used in districts. I would agree. We would not bring you a waiver request that didn't have that level of rigor.
Any other discussion? Any objection? Motion carries. Next item.
Item 2.3 on page 8, consideration of revising the textbook adoption timeline. The department recommendation is to approve.
I don't have any public comment on this. Superintendent, would you like to brief the board?
Members, as you know, the department, this is a long and convoluted thing.
I said brief.
All right. The department is required to conform with both a state law suggesting that we will approve textbooks every year, and that BESE is to create a textbook adoption cycle. Years ago, BESE created a textbook adoption cycle that essentially says that every 7 years, certain textbooks shall be approved, and there shall be a committee established and so on. Last year, we worked with Representative Hoffman on legislation to try to change this and make it more of a rolling process. And here's why this is so important. The texts that a lot of districts are beginning to use are online texts. They're updated on a daily basis. States and districts are also using not just text from the 3 big publishers, Houghton Mifflin, McGraw-Hill, and Pearson Scott Forsman, which used to be the way it was done, Scholastic. But they're using text produced by literally hundreds of online publishers that are smaller and update their content much more regularly. So the idea that a state agency can adequately cover every single one of those textbooks, and then that we should do it on only a 7-year cycle, is really out of step with today's realities. We tried to change that in the law. The legislature said, we're concerned about changing in the law because we still want the state to approve things. So what we're asking you to do is to create a task force. We are creating a task force. That task force is to be implemented per the legislative resolution that was passed amended in the Senate and then ultimately passed by both houses. And what we are asking you here for is allow us to not have to conduct the old process while a task force is working at the order of the legislature on developing a new process. We are simply asking your ability to give us the ability to just delay until the task force has produced this new process. We will then conduct this new process. We totally agree with the idea that we should be making recommendations to districts, but we're caught in a bit of a bind here because the legislature's asked us to convene this task force, and yet your regulations tell us that we should be doing the old process. We're asking for a simple delay in this new process.
Is there, Ms. Hill?
This task force that we must create as a board, would the task force that we create going to be individuals that the board nominates and approve, or would it be the current textbook committee?
It's the legislature's committee.
Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions? Is there any opposition? Oh, we need a motion, sorry. Is there a motion? Mr. Garvey? I need a second. Mr. Gio? Is there any opposition? Motion carries. Next item, please.
Next item is item 4.1 on page 11. Consideration, of revisions to Bulletin 1706, Regulations for Implementation of the Children with Exceptionalities Act, Subpart 1, Regulations for Students with Disabilities, Section 543, Restrictions on the Use of Seclusion or Physical Restraint. The Department recommendation is to approve as a notice of intent.
Mr. Gio motions. Is there a second? Dr. Moranti? I understand, Superintendent, that this is to clarify that these guidelines are for students with disabilities as opposed to talking about students with exceptionalities in general. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Does the board have any discussion on this one? Is there any opposition? Motion carries. Next item, please.
Next item is item 4.2 on page 13. Consideration of revisions to Bulletin 741, Louisiana Handbook for School Administrators, and Bulletin 135, Health and Safety, in response to recently enacted state legislation. The Department recommendation is to approve as notice of intent.
Is there a motion? Dr. Moranti moves. Ms. Orange-Jones seconds. Superintendent, would you like to brief us on this one?
Members, this is Act 329 of this year's legislative session provides essentially a set of requirements regarding reporting, regarding other requirements for schools, school employees, and so on. The provisions here require an update to Bulletin 741. I recognize that that's not words that we take lightly around these parts, but nevertheless, the changes are to emergency planning and procedures. And this really came out of last year's tragic events in Connecticut. This was a bill that was passed by Representative Henskins, who I believe is in Dr. Beebe's, or is it maybe in Ms. Bopey's district. The changes require that the principal or the school leader submit the school's crisis management response plan to the local superintendent for his or her approval, that there be an annual revision, and that there be a safety drill within the first 30 days of each school year to rehearse the plan. There's then a teacher bill of rights that is contained within this as well, and a change to the student academic records and reports section. These are all essentially legislative resolutions that require some procedural cleanup of Bulletin 741. They're important, but they are not to the depth and kind of systemic impact that past changes to 741 have required.
Are there questions from the board members? We do not have any public comment. Yes, Ms. Beebe, Dr. Beebe.
On page 15?
Page 15.
Yes. Section B, just for clarification, well, it's not a new item, but it's just that districts have to schedule parent orientation for students, but then, of course, those parents who fail to show up, we have satisfied that requirement, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it says, I think it's a general, that's in the law. We'll conduct a parent orientation. I don't think it means that if a parent doesn't show up that you're legally out of bounds, but
just you show a good faith effort.
Yes, correct.
Any other board members? Is there any opposition? Motion carries. Next item.
Next item is on page 19, item 4.3. Consideration of revisions to Bulletin 741, Louisiana Handbook for School Administrators to reflect district feedback regarding Carnegie credit policy. The department recommendation is to approve as a notice of intent.
Is there a motion? A motion by Dr. Moranti, second by Mr. Gio. Superintendent, I understand this to be clarification on how we are going to approach students receiving credit for exams.
Correct.
Or credit for course.
Correct. Members, there's a difficult thing to consider, which is that if a student takes a course, fails the course, but passes the end of course test at the end of the course, for example, what should be done? And you might make an argument that the student should retake the test at some point. On the other hand, you might make an argument, no, the student's already passed the test and shouldn't have to take the test. They should just have to retake the course. There are a number of kind of sequences like that. I'm happy to answer your questions, but you'll see that this policy addresses a number of them. Number, what happens when you pass a course but not a test? Second, what happens when you're just taking a credit recovery course? Should you have to take the end of course test along with the credit recovery course? These all then get wrapped into the very difficult fact that tests are only administered twice a year, once in December and once again in May. And so, you're kind of trying to fit real world lives in with that testing schedule. And so this deals with technical issues around that process. I'm happy to answer questions about any of the specific scenarios, but there are multiple scenarios contained within this policy.
Mr. Romer?
I know there's probably a million scenarios that are possible, and it's impossible, we're not going to be able to go through them all. To what extent are principals or superintendents, and I don't know, I have no idea what the answer is to this, giving any authority or any leeway in decision-making in these particular circumstances? Are they given any, or is that why we're getting more specific on, how that is dealt with?
Well, on grading policy, they have ranges, and so they can choose within those ranges of how the end of course test counts. Let me walk through just one specific, because I think this is the one. This issue arose out of districts, and so let me walk through this specifically. If you pass an end of course test, if you pass an end of course test but you fail the course generally, then there's the districts are coming to us and saying, well, can we simply declare that the student is proficient? And, I know that you all probably, and at South Lafourche, you probably have seen this happen before. You've got not with you, by the way, but with someone else. You've got maybe you've heard of it happening before, okay? I know you haven't experienced it and none of your friends have. But, it creates an odd duality because if you, on one hand, we're all about saying, look, mastery is mastery, but on the other hand, you kind of undermine a teacher if you say, well, look, you can take the course and you don't really have to ever pass the course, you just have to, So working with superintendents, we basically said that educators were concerned that the new policy allowed students to fail a course but pass the end of course test. And the intent of a flexibility policy would be to allow students to either bypass a course for which they already possess the skills or to pass through a course at an accelerated pace. It is not to allow someone to take a course, fail it, and then pass the test and get out of it. So we've got all these flexibility policies. The intent of that is not to have people skirt around things. So we're recommending a revision that clarifies that intent, that you can't just take a course and fail it and then somehow not fail it. If a student is enrolled in a course for the first time that is not identified as one of these accelerated courses or credit recovery, they must earn credit using the traditional seat time pathway. In other words, they do have to earn credit by passing that class. In other words, the counselor or the teacher or the parent has to say at the outset, what's the purpose of this class? If the purpose of this class is for you to sit for the class and succeed in it, then you are to pass the class and not try to skirt around it. On the other hand, if the purpose is you're in a credit recovery or an accelerated path and you're just trying to show mastery with no concern about seat time, then that's fine too. Then the test determines it. So it's that kind of flexibility we're trying to give the school while at the same time not undermining the teacher as they get into that. I don't know if that.
Yes, good explanation. Is there any other discussion on this item? Is there any objection? Motion carries. This meeting is adjourned.